Hi, boys and girls. So let's continue with Charlotte's Web. We're actually getting close to the end. I think we have about 4 or 5, maybe 6 chapters left. So today is going to be chapters 19 and 20. We've really gotten pretty far on this. So I really hope you're enjoying this. Again, this is one of my favorite books. So yesterday when we left off, everyone was at the fair. And if you remember, Templeton had figured out all of the wonderful things he could go and find to eat. He had found one more word, though, in some newsprint. If you remember, he crawled inside the newspaper there, and he found the word humble. Oops, can you see it there? That's the word that Charlotte has decided to put in her web, and she has said this will be her last word that she puts in the web for Wilbur. We also met that very, very big pig yesterday. Do you remember his name? The one with the deep voice. Yes, his name was Uncle. Do you remember him? Let's see if I can find his picture. Oh, there he is. Do you remember him? Right. So Charlotte was a little concerned because she said based on his size, he might win the prize for the best pig, but we'll have to wait and see what happens. So chapter 19, if you remember, when we left off, was called the egg sack. And I decided not to show you the picture that was on the page yet that goes with this chapter. So I'm going to start reading it and then I'll show you the picture of what that looks like. Okay, so this is chapter 19. Next morning, when the first light came into the sky and the sparrows stirred in the trees, when the cows rattled their chains and the rooster crowed and the early automobiles went whispering along the road, Wilbur awoke and looked for Charlotte. He saw her up overhead in a corner near the back of his pen. She was very quiet. Her 8 legs were spread wide. She seemed to have shrunk during the night. Next to her, attached to the ceiling, Wilbur saw a very curious object. It was sort of like a sack or cocoon. It was peach-colored. It looked as though it were made of cotton candy. "Are you awake, Charlotte?" he said softly. "Yes," came her answer. "What is that nifty little thing? Did you make it?" "I did indeed," replied Charlotte in a weak voice. "Is that a plaything?" "Plaything? I should say not. It is my egg sack, my magnum opus." "I don't know what a magnum opus is," said Wilbur. "That's Latin," said Charlotte. "It means great work. This egg sack is my great work, the finest thing I have ever made." "What's inside it?" asked Wilbur. "Eggs?" 514 of them," she replied. 514, said Wilbur. "You're kidding." "No, I'm not. I counted them. I got started counting, so I just kept on, just to keep my mind occupied." "It is a perfectly beautiful egg sack," said Wilbur, feeling happy as though he had constructed it himself. All right, so here's the picture I had covered yesterday. There you can see, there's the egg sack that Charlotte made. And inside of there are those 514 little eggs. And you can see she had to make a lot of thread there to hold that egg sack in place. Yep, pretty amazing, huh? Spiders can have a lot of eggs. That's a lot of little eggs. "Yes, it is pretty," replied Charlotte, patting the sack with her 2 front legs. "Anyway, I can guarantee it's strong. It's made out of the toughest material I have. It's also waterproof. The eggs are inside and will be warm and dry." "Charlotte," said Wilbur dreamily, "are you really going to have 514 children?" "If nothing happens, yes," she said. "Of course, they won't show up until next spring." Wilbur noticed that her voice sounded a little sad. "What makes you sound so downhearted? I should think you'd be terribly happy about this." "Oh, don't pay any attention to me," she said. "I just don't have much pep anymore. I guess I feel sad because I won't ever see my children." "What do you mean you won't see your children? Of course you will. We'll all see them. It's going to be simply wonderful. Next spring in the barn cellar with 514 baby spiders running all over the place. And the geese will have a new set of goslings and the sheep will have their lambs." "Maybe," said Charlotte quietly. "However, I have a feeling I'm not going to see the results of last night's efforts. I don't feel good at all. I think I'm languishing, to tell you the truth." Wilbur didn't understand the word languish, and he hated to bother Charlotte by asking her to explain, but he was so worried he felt he should ask. "What does languishing mean?" "It means I'm slowing down, feeling my age. I'm not young anymore, Wilbur. But I don't want you to worry about me. This is your big day. Look at my web. Doesn't it show up well with all the dew on it? Charlotte's web had never looked more beautiful than it looked that morning. Each strand held dozens of bright drops of early morning dew. The light came from the east. The light from the east struck it and made it as plain and clear. It was a perfect piece of designing and building. In another hour or two, a steady stream of people would pass by, admiring it and reading it and looking at Wilbur and marveling at the miracle. As Wilbur was studying the web, a pair of whiskers and a sharp face appeared. Slowly, Templeton dragged himself across the pen and threw himself into the corner. "I'm back," he said in a husky voice. "What a night!" The rat was swollen twice to his normal size. His stomach was as big around as a jelly jar. Wait, do you see this? Look at him. Oh, look at Templeton. Can you imagine how much he must have eaten to get a stomach that big? Oh my goodness, look at that. Oh my goodness. He's one happy rat, isn't he? All right, let's find out what he got into. "What a night," he said again. "What a feast, a real gorge. I must have eaten the remains of 30 lunches. Never have I ever had such leavings, and everything so seasoned with the passage of time and the heat of the day. Oh, it was rich, my friends, it was rich." "You ought to be ashamed of yourself," said Charlotte in disgust. "It would serve you right if you had an acute attack of indigestion." That means an upset stomach. "Don't worry about my stomach," snarled Templeton. "It can handle anything. And by the way, I've got some bad news. As I came past that pig next door, the one that calls himself Uncle, I noticed a blue tag on the front of his pen. That means he's won first prize. I guess you're licked, Wilbur. You might as well relax. Nobody's going to hang a medal on you. Furthermore, I wouldn't be surprised if Zuckerman changes his mind about you. Wait till he gets a hankering for some pork or bacon." "Be still, Templeton," said Charlotte. "You're too stuffed and bloated to know what you're saying. Don't pay any attention to him, Wilbur." Wilbur tried not to think about what the rat had just said, so he decided to change the subject. "Templeton," he said, "if you weren't being so dopey, you would have noticed that Charlotte has made an egg sac, and she's going to be a mother. For your information, there are 514 eggs in that peachy little sack." "Is this true?" asked the rat, eyeing up that sack suspiciously. "Yes, it's true," said Charlotte. "Congratulations," murmured Templeton. "This has been a night." He closed his eyes, pulled some straw over himself, and dropped off into a deep sleep. Wilbur and Charlotte were glad to be rid of him for a little while. At 9 o'clock, Mr. Arable's truck rolled into the fairgrounds and came to a stop at Wilbur's pen. Everybody climbed out. "Look," said Fern. "Look at Charlotte's web. Look what it says." The grown-ups and the children joined hands and stood there, studying the new sign. "Humble," said Mr. Zuckerman. "Now isn't that just the word for Wilbur?" Everyone rejoiced to find that the miracle of the web had been repeated. Wilbur gazed up lovingly into their faces. He looked very humble and very grateful. Fern winked at Charlotte. Lurvy soon got busy. He poured a bucket of warm slops into the trough, and while Wilbur ate his breakfast, Lurvy scratched him gently with a smooth stick. "Wait a minute," cried Avery. "Look at this." He pointed to the blue tag on Uncle's pen. "This pig has won first prize already." The Zuckermans and the Arables stared at the tag. Mrs. Zuckerman began to cry. Nobody said a word. They just stared at the tag, and they stared at Uncle. They stared at the tag again. Lurvy took out an enormous handkerchief and blew his nose very loudly. So loud, in fact, the noise was heard by the stable boys in the horse barn. "Can I have some money?" asked Fern. "I want to go out to the Midway." "You stay right where you are," said her mother, and tears came to Fern's eyes. "What's everybody crying about?" said Mr. Zuckerman. "Let's get busy. Edith, bring that buttermilk." Mrs. Zuckerman wiped her eyes with her handkerchief. She went to the truck and came back with her gallon jar of buttermilk. "Bath time," said Mr. Zuckerman cheerfully, and he and Mrs. Zuckerman and Avery climbed into Wilbur's pen. Avery slowly poured the buttermilk on Wilbur's head and back as it trickled down his sides and his cheeks. Mr. and Mrs. Zuckerman rubbed it into his hair and skin. Passersby stopped to watch. Pretty soon, quite a crowd had gathered. Wilbur grew beautifully white and smooth. The morning sun shone through his pink ears. "He isn't as big as the pig next door," said one person, "but he's cleaner, and that's what I like." "So do I," said another man. "He's humble, too," said a woman who was reading the sign above his pen. Everybody who visited the pig pen had a good word to say about Wilbur. Everyone admired the web, and of course, nobody noticed Charlotte. Suddenly, a voice was heard on the loudspeaker. "Attention, please," it said. "Will Mr. Homer Zuckerman bring his famous pig to the judge's booth in front of the grandstand? A special award will be made there in 20 minutes. Everyone's invited to attend. Crate your pig, please, Mr. Zuckerman, and report to the judge's booth promptly." For a moment after this announcement, the Arables and Zuckermans were unable to speak or move. Then Avery picked up a handful of straw and threw it in the air and gave it a loud yell. The straw fluttered down like confetti into Fern's hair. Mr. Zuckerman hugged Mrs. Zuckerman. Mr. Arable kissed Mrs. Arable. Avery kissed Wilbur. Lurvy shook hands with everybody. Fern hugged her mother. Avery hugged Fern. And Mrs. Arable hugged Mrs. Zuckerman. Up overhead in the shadows of the ceiling, Charlotte crouched unseen, her front legs encircling her sack. Her heart was not beating as strongly as usual, and she felt weary and old. But she was sure, at last, that she had saved Wilbur's life, and she felt peaceful and contented. There's the picture of everyone celebrating. "We have no time to lose," said Mr. Zuckerman. "Hurry, help with the crate." "Can I have some money?" asked Fern. "You wait," said Mrs. Arable. "Can't you see everyone is busy?" "Put that empty buttermilk jar into the truck," commanded Mr. Arable. Avery grabbed the jar and rushed to the truck. "Does my hair look all right?" said Mrs. Zuckerman. "Looks fine," said Mr. Zuckerman, and he and Lurvy set the crate down for Wilbur. "You didn't even look at my hair." "You're all right, Edith. Just keep calm," said Mrs. Arable. Templeton, who was asleep in the straw, heard the commotion and woke up. He didn't know exactly what was going on, but when he saw the men shoving Wilbur in the crate, he made up his mind to go along. He watched his chance, and when no one was looking, he crept into the crate and buried himself in the straw at the bottom. "All ready, boys," cried Mr. Zuckerman. "Let's go." He and Mr. Arable and Lurvy and Avery grabbed the crate and boosted it over the side of the pen and up into the truck. Fern jumped aboard and sat on the crate. She still had straw in her hair and looked very excited. Mr. Arable started the motor. Everyone climbed in, and off they drove to the judge's booth in front of the grandstand. As they passed the Ferris wheel, Fern gazed up at it and wished she were in the top car with Henry Fussy. All right, so this is chapter 20. And this is called The Hour of Triumph. "Special announcement," said the loudspeaker. "The management of the fair takes great pleasure in presenting Mr. Homer L. Zuckerman and his famous pig. The truck bearing this extraordinary animal is now approaching the infield. Kindly stand back and give the truck room to proceed. In a few moments, the pig will be unloaded in the special judging ring in front of the grandstand, where a special award will be made. Will the crowd please make their way and let the truck pass? Thank you." Wilbur trembled when he heard this speech. He felt happy but a little dizzy. The truck crept along at a low speed. Crowds of people surrounded it, and Mr. Arable had to drive very carefully in order not to hit anyone. At last he managed to reach the judge's stand. Avery jumped out and lowered the tailgate. "I'm scared," said Mrs. Zuckerman. "Hundreds of people are looking at us." "Cheer up," said Mrs. Arable. "This is fun." "Unload your pig, please," said the loudspeaker. "All together now, boys," said Mr. Zuckerman. Several men stepped forward from the crowd to help lift the crate. Avery was the busiest helper of them all. "Tuck in your shirt, Avery," cried Mrs. Zuckerman, "and tighten your belt." "Can't you see I'm busy?" he said in disgust. "Look," said Fern, "there's Henry." "Don't shout," Fern said her mother, "and don't point." "Can I please have some money?" asked Fern. "Henry invited me to go on the Ferris wheel, and I don't think he has money." Mrs. Arable opened her handbag. "Here," she said. "Now don't get lost and be back at our regular meeting place by the pig pen very soon." Fern raced off, ducking and dodging through the crowd in search of Henry. "The Zuckerman pig is now being taken from his crate," boomed the voice. "Stand by for an announcement." Templeton, who was crouched low under the straw, said, "What a lot of nonsense," he muttered. "What a lot of fuss about nothing." Over in the pig pen, silent and alone, Charlotte rested. Her two front legs embraced her egg sac. Charlotte could hear everything that was said on the loudspeaker. The words gave her courage. This was her hour of triumph. As Wilbur came out of the crate, the crowd clapped and cheered. Mr. Zuckerman took off his cap and bowed. Lurvy pulled his big handkerchief from his pocket and wiped the sweat off the back of his neck. Avery knelt in the dirt by Wilbur's side, busily stroking him and showing off. Mrs. Zuckerman and Mrs. Arable stood on the running board of the truck. "Ladies and gentlemen," said the loudspeaker, "we now present Mr. Homer L. Zuckerman's distinguished pig. The fame of this unique animal has spread to the far corners of the earth, attracting many valuable tourists to our great state. Many of you will recall the never-to-be-forgotten last summer when writing appeared in the Web, calling the attention of all to the fact this pig was completely out of the ordinary. This miracle has never been fully explained, although learned men have visited the farm and observed the phenomenon. We simply know that we are dealing with supernatural forces here, and we should all feel proud and grateful. In the words of the spider web, ladies and gentlemen, this is some pig." Wilbur blushed. He stood perfectly still and tried to look his best. "This magnificent animal," continued the speaker, "is truly terrific. Look at him, ladies and gentlemen. Note the smoothness and whiteness of the coat. Observe his spotless skin, the healthy pink glow of his ears." "It's the buttermilk," whispered Mrs. Arable to Mrs. Zuckerman. "Note the general radiance of this animal. Then remember the day the word radiant appeared in the web. Whence came this mysterious writing? Not from the spider, we can rest assured. Spiders are very clever at weaving their webs, but needless to say, spiders cannot write." "Oh, they can't they?" murmured Charlotte to herself. "Ladies and gentlemen," continued the speaker, "I must not take any more of your time. On behalf of the governors of the fair, I have the honor of awarding the special prize of $25 to Mr. Zuckerman, together with a handsome bronze medal, suitably engraved in token of our appreciation of the part played by this pig, this radiant, terrific, humble pig, in attracting so many visitors to our great county fair." Wilbur had started to feel dizzier and dizzier. This long speech. When he heard the crowd began to cheer and clap, he suddenly fainted away. His legs collapsed, his mind went blank, and he fell to the ground. "What's wrong?" asked the loudspeaker. "What's going on? What's the trouble with your pig?" Avery was kneeling by Wilbur's head, stroking him. Mr. Zuckerman was dancing about, fanning his cap. "He's all right," said Mr. Zuckerman. "He gets these spells. He's modest, and he can't stand the praise." "Well, we can't give a prize to a dead pig," said the loudspeaker. "It's never been done before." "He isn't dead," said Mr. Zuckerman. "He's fainted. He gets embarrassed easily. Run for some water, Lurvy." Lurvy sprang from the judge's ring and disappeared. Templeton poked his head out of the straw. He noticed that the end of Wilbur's tail was within his reach. Templeton grinned. "I'll tend to this," he chuckled. He took Wilbur's tail in his mouth and bit it just as hard as he could. The pain revived Wilbur. In a flash, he was back on his feet. "Ouch!" he screamed. "Hooray!" yelled the crowd. "He's up, the pig's up. Good work, Zuckerman. That's some pig." Everyone was delighted. Mr. Zuckerman was the most pleased of all. He sighed with relief. Nobody had seen Templeton. The rat had done his work well. Okay, can you see this page? Look closely. Where's Templeton? There he is. Right, there's where he's biting the rat's tail, or biting the pig's tail to get him back on his feet. And there's Avery taking care of Wilbur. And now one of the judges climbed into the ring with the prizes. He handed Mr. Zuckerman 2 10s and a 5. Then he tied the medal around Wilbur's neck. Then he shook hands with Mr. Zuckerman while Wilbur blushed. Avery put out his hand, and the judge shook hands with him, too. The crowd cheered. A photographer took Wilbur's picture. A great feeling of happiness swept over the Zuckermans and the Arabels. This was the greatest moment in Mr. Zuckerman's life. It is deeply satisfying to win the prize in front of so many people. And there they are, there, winning their prize and getting, see that? And there's Wilbur with his medal. Look how cute he looks. Very humble, huh? Yeah, very sweet. As Wilbur was being shoved back into the crate, Lurvy came charging through the crowd carrying a pail of water. His eyes had a wild look. Without hesitating, he dashed the water at Wilbur. In his excitement, he missed him, and the water splashed all over Mr. Zuckerman and Avery, and they got soaking wet. "Oh, for goodness sake," said Mr. Zuckerman. "What ails you, Lurvy? Can't you see that pig's okay?" "You asked for water," he said. "I didn't ask for a shower." The crowd roared with laughter. Finally, Mr. Zuckerman had to laugh too. And of course, Avery was tickled to find himself so wet, and he immediately started to act like a clown. He pretended he was taking a shower bath. He made faces and danced around and rubbed imaginary soap on himself. Then he dried himself with an imaginary towel. "Avery, stop showing off," said his mother. But the crowd loved it. Avery heard nothing but the applause. He liked being the clown in the ring, with everyone watching in front of the grandstand. When he discovered there was still a little water left in the bottom, he raised it over his head and dumped it on himself and made faces. The children and the grandstand laughed with appreciation. At last things calmed down. Wilbur was loaded into the truck. Avery was led from the ring by his mother and placed on the seat of the truck to dry off. The truck, driven by Mr. Arable, crawled slowly back to the pig pen. Avery's wet trousers then made a huge wet spot on the seat. Okay, so that's the end of chapter 20. 21 is called The Last Day. So they have this last day at the fair, and then they're going to be going back to the barn. And now when I look through, oh, we only have 2 chapters left, boys and girls. So 21 and 22 will be our last 2 chapters, which I'll read tomorrow. And then I have a new chapter book that I'm going to start. So, all right, have a great day, everybody. Hope you enjoyed that. Bye.